Good day. Today is Wednesday, 4th June 2025, and this is going to be an especially short video. It is made late at night tonight because I have had a very full day here in Georgia, meeting my hosts, attending a conference, being provided with a tour around the city, getting an overall sense of the situation here in Georgia. I will be doing a fuller discussion of my impressions of Georgia and of the situation here in another program. But what I will say for the moment is this. Georgia has been through a significant political crisis. Over the last few months, there was an attempt by the opposition, which was defeated in the parliamentary elections, to contest the outcome. Western governments supported the opposition in these protests, as did Georgia's president, a former French diplomat who for a certain period of time refused to accept the expiry of her term. Nonetheless, and notwithstanding, and despite many claims that I've read and heard in the media in the West about the situation in Georgia, and in particular in the capital, Tbilisi, being unstable, my quick impression after being here for a few days is that, on the contrary, the situation is overall stable, that the government has secure control, that protests have diminished in scale to the extent that they're taking place at all, and that the economy continues to grow. So those are my overall impressions. The colour revolution, so far as I can see, has failed, and I get the strong impression that there is little support for the opposition, even here in Tbilisi, which I was told is the opposition's main stronghold. That is all I'm going to say about the situation in Georgia today. I will be discussing it, as I said, further in future programs. I want to turn now back to the situation in Ukraine, and I'm going to say a few things which have happened over the last 24 hours, because the key leaders in this conflict now, President Putin of Russia and President Trump of the United States, have each made extremely important and very interesting statements. Now, I am going to start with President Putin. President Putin called together a meeting of government members. This was not a meeting of Russia's Security Council. It was a meeting of government members, and it primarily discussed the attacks on the railway trains which have taken place in Bryansk and Kursk regions, and which have resulted in the destruction of railway bridges, damage to civilian trains, and injuries and, I believe, deaths amongst some Russian citizens. As I have discussed in recent programs, the Russian authorities are treating these attacks as acts of terrorism. They are not treating the attacks on the Russian air bases, which have attracted so much attention in the West, as acts of terrorism. They appear to acknowledge that these were legitimate military targets. Now, having said that, the comments that were made over the course of this meeting, which Putin headed, were extraordinary. Now, at the outset of the meeting, Putin heard a report from Vladimir Medinsky, the head of the Russian delegation to the Istanbul talks. He was also briefed by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Both Medinsky and Lavrov appeared to tell Putin that though no actual significant progress, indeed no actual progress at all, had been made over the course of the discussions, the negotiations, nonetheless, keeping the format, the Istanbul format, going, permitting thereby contacts to continue between Russia and Ukraine, in and of itself served a useful purpose. Now, Putin appears to have listened to all of this in stony silence, and clearly a very angry Putin indeed then went on to make certain very harsh statements which are now reported on the Kremlin's website and which I will now read out. He said, the recent blowing up of railway tracks in the Bryansk and Kursk region is, of course, a terrorist act. And decisions to commit such crimes were, of course, made in Ukraine at the political level. In other words, they were made by Zelensky and his officials. What I would like to note in this regard, of course, everywhere and always during armed conflicts, to our great regret, civilians suffer. But what happened in Bryansk, in the Bryansk region, was a targeted attack on civilians, and according to all international norms, such actions are called terrorism. I should say quickly and in parenthesis that, as I discussed in my previous video, Putin is actually correct about this. Putin then went on to say the following: all the crimes that were committed against civilians, including women and children, on the eve of the peace talks we proposed in Istanbul, was certainly aimed at disrupting the negotiation process. The civilian population was deliberately targeted. This only confirms our fears that the already illegitimate regime in Kiev, which once seized power, is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors, by sponsors he means the Western powers, perhaps at this time principally France and Britain, but also perhaps Germany also, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices of terrorists. Let us recall, just recently, the Ukrainian authorities and their allies dreamed of a strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield. Today, against the backdrop of huge losses, retreating along the entire line of contact, trying to intimidate Russia, the Kiev leadership has moved on to organizing terrorist acts. And at the same time, they are asking to suspend military actions for 30 or even 60 days, asking for a meeting at the highest level. This relates to Zelensky's request for a summit meeting between himself and Putin. How can such meetings be held in these conditions? What should we talk about? Who negotiates with those who rely on terror, with terrorists? And why should they be encouraged by providing a respite in military operations that will be used to pump the regime with Western weapons to continue the forced mobilization and preparation of other terrorist acts similar to those that were carried out in Bryansk and Kursk regions? And then he goes on to say that he will then have a further briefing with Lavrov and possibly with Medinsky. But then he goes on to say, what kind of authorities can the leaders of a thoroughly rotten and completely corrupt regime have? The whole world is talking about this. What kind of competence can those be proud of? By whose will the Ukrainian armed forces, for example, in the Kursk region, suffered absolutely senseless, huge losses, and today suffer one defeat after another on the battlefield. We are dealing with people who not only do not possess any significant competence in anything, but also elementary political culture. If they allow themselves to make certain statements and even direct insults to those with whom they're trying to negotiate about something. As for the latest refusal to agree to a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days for humanitarian reasons, this is not the first time. It does not surprise us, but only convinces us that today's regime in Kiev does not need peace at all. Peace for it most likely means the loss of power, and power for the regime apparently is more important than peace and than the lives of people who they apparently do not consider their own. So that was Putin. Now those are, I think, the harshest words he has ever used to describe the government in Kiev. He said very harsh things about them in the past, but I think this goes further than anything else he has ever said previously at any time. And I have to say, reading those statements, it seems to me that Putin is now questioning the purpose and point of any negotiations with the authorities in Kiev at all. He says, how can such meetings be held in these conditions? What should we talk about? Who negotiates with those who rely on terror, with terrorists? And why should they be encouraged by providing a respite in military operations that will be used to pump the regime with Western weapons to continue the forced mobilization and preparation of other terrorist acts similar to those that were carried out in Bryansk and Kursk region? Now, to me, as I said, that looks like Putin at this particular and specific moment calling into question the entire purpose of negotiations with the Ukrainian authorities at all. But in some respects, there was something else he said which I thought at least equally important. And that was the way in which he described what he called the regime in Kiev. And again, I quote him, "This only confirms our fears that the already illegitimate regime in Kiev, which once seized power, is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices of terrorists." Now, up to this time, the Russian military operation in Ukraine has been conducted as a special military operation. I have floated in the possibility in the past that the Russians might choose at some point to upgrade this special military operation into an anti-terrorist organization, which would change the entire character of the war. It would, for example, were that to happen, mean that the Russian authorities would authorize themselves to go chasing and seeking the death or capture of prominent Ukrainian officials, including conceivably President Zelensky himself. After all, over the course of these words, Putin has himself said that the attacks in Bryansk and Kursk were authorized by Ukraine at a political level. Now, recently, in his speech, in his comments to the media on 11th May 2025, the comments over the course of which Putin proposed direct negotiations with the Ukrainians in Istanbul on the 15th of May, resulting in the meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which took place in Istanbul on the 16th of May. Over the course of that discussion, those comments to the media, Putin used for the first time, and I have verified this, for the first time, the words war to describe the conflict which is taking place in Ukraine today. And whilst anti-terrorist operation, if that is what this conflict is now upgraded to, would still fall short in Russian legal and military terminology of an all-out war, it is clearly heading in that direction. Of course, going back to what I said previously, if the Russians have decided, if Putin himself has decided that the moment has come to end the negotiations, to treat the authorities in Kiev as terrorists, to treat the entire government in Kiev, what he refers to as the illegitimate regime in Kiev, and note that he is basically saying that it is illegitimate, not because Zelensky has outstayed his term, but because of the way in which it gained power through an illegal coup which took place in February 2014. Well, in the event that all of this is the case, then obviously negotiations with that regime cannot take place, because Russian law and Russian policy is that Russia does not negotiate with terrorist organizations. Now, reading these comments, it's important to say that no final decision has been made, and both Medinsky and Lavrov, over the course of this meeting, went out of their way to tell Putin that despite all of the provocations, and Lavrov said that these were, from the Ukrainian side, provocations, despite all of the provocations, Russia should nonetheless continue the negotiation process. So there is going to be a discussion about this at the highest level of the Russian government. Putin, as I have discussed in many programs, is not, contrary to what many people in the West believe, the sole decision maker. He always seeks advice from senior officials and is careful before he makes a final decision to solicit and obtain that advice. But all I will say is that we are closer to the point where the Russians decide that negotiations with the authorities in Kiev are pointless, and that the moment has therefore come for the negotiations to be ended, for the special military operation to be upgraded, perhaps to an anti-terrorist operation, and for the Russians to act upon what that means. Now, all of this is taking place even as the Russian army continues its advances on the various battlefronts, but perhaps even more importantly, as rumours have been circulating inside Russia that the Russians are preparing to deploy their Oreshnik missiles on a mass scale, perhaps in retaliation for these attacks that the Ukrainians conducted over the last 36 hours. So anyway, those are the comments that Putin has made. Now, the other official who has been speaking is, of course, President Donald Trump, and he hasn't been speaking exactly. He's published another message on Truth Social, and I'm not going to read it in detail, but he said that he's spoken on the phone to Putin for over an hour. He said that this was a good call. He said that nonetheless, Putin is in no mood at the moment to contemplate ceasefires or to move forward towards some kind of quick peace settlement. And Trump also says that Putin is preparing a major retaliation for the various attacks that have taken place against Russia over the last 24 hours. Now, in the meeting in Moscow, no mention was made of the attacks on the air bases. In Trump's Truth Social post, he made it appear that, in fact, Putin's retaliation, Russia's retaliation, will be principally in connection with the attacks on the air bases. The reality, I believe, is that the Russians have brushed off the attacks on the air bases. We now have satellite data from the air bases, And I think we can say with confidence that the Ukrainians hugely exaggerated the damage that they did. They did not destroy 40 Russian aircraft. They did not destroy 17 Russian aircraft. They appear to have destroyed 3 old Tupolev 95 bombers and caused damage to 3 more aircraft. 1 more Tupolev 95 and 2 Tupolev 22 M3s, but these apparently can be repaired. In some of the air bases, no damage was done at all. I think the Russians would accept this as acceptable war losses, war damage. But terrorist attacks, they're treating differently, if only because they have impacted on Russian civilians in the way that Putin has said. Now, of course, the attack on the air bases and the attack on the railway trains, the railway system, were not the only attacks that the Ukrainians have carried out over the last 24 hours. Earlier yesterday, reports were circulating about further Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean bridge. And the Ukrainians released footage of an explosion, a small explosion, near one of the piers of the bridge, and were saying that damage had in fact been done to the bridge. It seems that in fact no damage was done to the bridge at all, that an attack was carried out by the Ukrainians using drones, water drones. The great majority of these water drones were intercepted and destroyed by the Russian military. One managed to penetrate the initial defensive barriers, but apparently hit some further barrier close to one of the piers and exploded without doing any major damage to the bridge. For certain periods over the course of yesterday, the bridge was closed to road traffic, but it subsequently reopened. And as far as I can tell, no actual damage to the bridge itself was done. That attack, at least, was a failure. However, we come back to this question that Putin has brought up of terrorism. Now, it seems that the Crimean bridge no longer serves any military function. As I discussed in a recent program, the Ukrainians themselves have released footage of a Russian ammunition train in, I believe, Zaporozhye region, heading perhaps towards Crimea, using one of the new railway lines that the Russians have created. It seems that these railway lines are indeed operating, and it seems that military supplies and probably civilian supplies are sent to Crimea by rail, over land. They are no longer sent to Crimea across the Crimean bridge. The people who use the Crimean bridge are civilians. This is civilian traffic, people traveling from Krasnodar in Russia to Crimea and from Crimea to Krasnodar. So you could argue again that this is a civilian facility, given that the bridge is in continuous operation. An attack on it could arguably be treated as a further attempted attack on civilians, and therefore, according to Putin's formulations, an act of terrorism. Now, Putin did not bring up the question of the Crimean bridge attack over the course of the Moscow meeting. Probably because no damage was done and no civilians were injured or killed. But we go back to his comments about a terrorist attack and the fact that the Kiev regime, as he calls it, is degenerating, according to him, into a terrorist organization. And I'm going to suggest yet again that the attack on the Crimean bridge was extremely ill-judged and was clearly intended, like the attacks on the railways, to either put pressure on the Russians or to disrupt the Istanbul negotiations. In any event, these incidents were clearly coordinated, and they were probably coordinated with a larger operation to attack the air bases. In fact, as Simplicius the thinker has correctly said, one can see how over the course of the last 48, 96 hours, Ukraine has attempted to carry out a sequence of attacks on Russia, which presumably the Ukrainians were expecting or anticipating would provoke a strong reaction inside Russia, perhaps a political crisis or something like that. So you had the attacks on the air bases, the attacks on the railway lines in Bryansk and Kursk region, the attack on the Crimean Bridge. And I think it's true to say that overall, the effect of the attacks was significantly less than the Ukrainians probably hoped. The bridge was undamaged. The air bases did receive a certain amount of damage, but obviously significantly less than the Ukrainians hoped. And, well, the railway line attacks were successful, but successful in terms of targeting civilians. The railway lines, just to say, contrary perhaps again to Ukrainian expectations, have been repaired by the Russians. They were repaired within a period of about 24 hours and are back in full operation. I said in my program, after the attacks took place, that the Russians have specialized military units whose task it is to repair railway lines quickly, and that is exactly what happened. I think the Ukrainians were expecting that the railway lines would be closed for perhaps a week or even longer. Instead, they were only closed for a brief period of about 24 hours. Anyway, Trump saw all of this, was clearly alarmed by the implications, telephoned Putin, tried to find out what Putin was intending to do, and Putin told him that indeed and in fact Russia does intend to retaliate, and judging by the rumors, there's no official word from the Russian authorities or from the Kremlin, some kind of a retaliation using the Oreshniks might be in the process of preparation. Anyway, for the rest, the interesting thing was that Trump then, in his Truth Social post, entirely changed the subject. And he discussed Iran. And he said that he'd had a lengthy conversation with Putin about Iran, and that Putin had agreed with him that Iran should not acquire nuclear weapons and was prepared to work with the United States to that objective, and that Putin and Trump were prepared to not only work together, but that Putin would undertake contacts with the Iranian leadership to facilitate this process. Now, here I'm going to say it straightforwardly. It was exactly what I predicted and what we discussed on the Duran back in January. Over the course of this Truth Social post, Donald Trump has gone further than at any point previously to confirm that the Russians and the Americans are in discussion with each other about finding some kind of a solution to the nuclear crisis with Iran. Why did Donald Trump bring up this topic at all in this Truth Social post? Well, I am going to suggest that he did it for one very specific reason. Over the following week, Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal are apparently planning to propose their bone-crunching sanctions, to move forward with their bone-crunching sanctions bill in the Senate. Now, there's been quite a lot of articles and discussions about this, and there's been a very interesting interview given by Lindsey Graham himself. Over the course of that interview, Lindsey Graham made it perfectly clear that the country that he's actually targeting is China. He came up with an extraordinary theory that the war in Ukraine would only end if China was pressured to end it. Completely unable to understand that, given that China is not a party to the war, but let's put aside these gymnastics of logic which Lindsey Graham commits himself to. But anyway, Lindsey Graham was making it perfectly clear that the 500% sanctions are targeting China, not actually Russia directly at all. Now, it's clear to me that Donald Trump does not want to see these sanctions brought into effect. There's been various articles, including a long one in The Guardian, which said that if Trump were to oppose these sanctions and were to make that fact clear to the Senate, it's likely that support for the sanctions amongst Republican senators would diminish, and that Speaker Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, was extremely unlikely to put the sanctions package to the House if Trump made it clear that he did not want that to happen. The Guardian article also said that even if the sanctions bill was passed and voted into law, it would be up to Trump to enforce it, and he might choose not to do so. So, could it be that Trump, who perhaps understands that 500% sanctions, tariffs on China, which is what Lindsey Graham is talking about, would hurtle the United States back into an economic war with China of a kind that it was being waged in April and early May, an economic war which almost caused a crisis in the US economy, that Trump does not want those tariffs put in place precisely for that reason, and that he's now given himself an excuse for not supporting these tariffs, these so-called secondary bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham is now proposing, by saying that he needs Russia's help, Putin's help, to sort out the problem with Iran. It's an interesting possibility. I wonder how it will play out. I get the sense that Lindsey Graham is very keen to move forward with his sanctions stroke tariffs plan. He probably has support from a majority of senators. I suspect he will be very angry with his Truth Social post. He's said all kinds of, frankly, not very complimentary things about Trump, that Trump relies too much on charm and that the time has come to use harder measures to achieve what Lindsey Graham calls a just peace in Ukraine, in other words, Russia's defeat. Well, anyway, I get the sense that Trump is not keen on this tariff, sanctions, whatever it is you want to call it, idea, and this Truth Social post might have been his way of bringing it, at least for the moment, taking it off the table. As I say, we will see whether this succeeds. We will see whether Lindsey Graham does decide to risk a split with Trump by moving forward with this package. There were reports in the American media that US senators have been piling on the pressure on Trump to again resume support for Ukraine, something which Trump absolutely does not want to do, and that Trump has been getting increasingly bothered by this pressure. Anyway, we will see how this plays out. The negotiation process between Russia and Ukraine hangs by a thread. Putin, as I said, is very, very angry and appears to be thinking of calling the whole thing off. Lavrov and Medinsky are going to have their work cut out, I suspect, trying to persuade him not to do that. It's possible that sometime next week we will see the entire military operation, the Russian military operation in Ukraine, upgraded to an anti-terrorist operation. Putin's words clearly point in that direction. In the meantime, Donald Trump has to contend with pressure from Congress and the Senate to impose sanctions on Russia, tariffs on China that he really doesn't want to impose, and he's therefore seeking Russian help with Iran to avoid that happening. We are looking at an extremely complicated situation, but I think we are close to breaking point. I am not going to discuss the military situation in this program further either, but it seems to me that we are close to breaking point on that too. Well, this is where I end today's programs. I'm sorry about the late hour of this video. This has been a very, very full day. Tomorrow will be less so, I believe, and for that reason you should be getting my program at a more reasonable hour tomorrow. That's me for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.